Chiara particularly said that I think makes sense or relates back to something that we've been looking into yesterday, because the program was actually divided in 2 days, but then logistics of contributors availability obviously always mix things up. But what we looked into yesterday was really trying to sort of locate this whole discussion about fake news and false information and manipulation of the unconscious, etc., into a broader history of propaganda, and particularly within Italian history of propaganda. And we started particularly by looking into different tools that were developed in the sort of early colonial period of the 20th century in Italy, and later tools that were developed during the fascist regime. So what also type of journals, for example, were distributed, which always had science as a keyword. It's really how science and this idea, this fake idea of scientific knowledge that basically legitimizes exploitation and legitimizes, essentially in that case, a narrative that would support white supremacy. Hence legitimize the colonial enterprise on the one hand and structural state racism on the other. And so this idea of science was kind of central in that sense. We actually looked particularly in Defense of Race, which was a publication that was published during the fascist regime from 1938, which is the moment in which the racial laws are issued, to 1943. And one of the key words is science. It's science, polemics, and a third that I can remember now. Anyway, Chiara Figone, I'm super happy to have her with us. She has been actually working with Warren Neidich for a very long time. Chiara is a writer, an editor, a designer, an organizer, assembly maker, and a dear friend. So I'm really happy to have you with us. She is, among many other things, the co-founder of Archive Publishing, which is a publishing house, but also much more than that. They do books, programs, engage in long-term collaborations with artists, particularly actually with filmmakers, and of course, as the title suggests, engage very much also into rethinking the importance of archive, and particularly I would say what has been not forgotten but consciously erased from, let's say, collective memory, hence what type of different archives and archival practices can support and encourage towards new forms of looking into the future. So in that sense, I think that the project that she will present is, you know, after so many analyses in these days, it's quite interesting because it's also looking what type of projects can actually be initiated, also really from sort of grassroots initiatives, in order to sort of compensate those missing grounds. Thank you again, and I leave the floor.
So where do we start? This is going to be a very strong changes register. So we go down to something very practical, which is a work that I've been trying to develop with the students, but in Milan. So before we go there, of course, I want to thank you very much, Antonia and Warren, for inviting me. I have been participating and organizing many of these encounters between academics outside the academia, which I think is extremely important to do outside the boundary of the academia, and trying to see how these moments of exchange and sharing can actually bring us to some practical outcomes. So that's why I thought today, but first and foremost, because I'm not an academic, but also I thought it could be interesting at the end of the day to really talk about or share with you some of the ideas that we have been trying to develop within the publishing and editorial course in Milan at NABA. So anyways, again, this is, I think, is an occasion not only to generate awareness and which is very important today, and also to exercise, to some extent, an ability to vulgarize some of the discourses that are extremely important and live within the academia, but how can we then deploy some of the outcomes into the practice, and how can certain researches can be encompassed in practices, which I'm now trying just to present to you or share with you one example that has been developed with the students in Milan at Naba University. Archive is teaching in an MA of curatorial practice and visual arts, so where students are actually trying to develop or form their practice as artists or curators. So this project, in a way, articulates different phases, is articulated in different phases and is open and ongoing. So again, I'm trying to share it with you in a very sort of simple way, trying to see if together we can maybe think about possible strategy to sharpen tools that we can use to resist to and counteract the resurfacing of fascist networks, actions, slogans, and policies. So, I mean, it is important to mention to me that NABA is a private school, so it is already in itself a complex territory from which to operate, and the relationships that are formed with the students are obviously very much impacted by the fact that it is a private school. And so since several years, Archive is conducting this publishing and editorial design course, and the classes are held by different members of Archive, so it's Paolo Caffoni, Lilia Di Bella, and myself. So we approach, in a way, each class as an editorial office in the making. So we develop with the students project that would reflect on the nature of making public and the implication of disseminating contents and ultimately exploring the political dimension of publishing and editing. So before elaborating more about the premises of the work with our students, I'd just like to say a few words about Archive, even though Antonia did an amazing job, I think even better than what I can do. But in any case, it's just because I like to sort of situate this work with the students within our practice at Archive, which has been developing slowly over a span of sort of 10 years. So Archive is a non-profit organization and a publishing house, an art space, a library, a journal. So our publishing program is very much connected with the discursive program and the exhibition program that we are running in the space. So we kind of really use the strategy of working in parallel in the space of the book and in an architectural physical space to approach similar questions of editing and curatorial. And Archive Journal is somehow, for us, a way of consolidating certain or leaving some traces of the voices that have contributed to the formation of Archive program. So we have chosen to name Archive, to name ourselves Archive, because archives, of course, carry an intrinsic complexity. Archives are not immune to the hegemonic imperialistic forces that built them. The power coloniality is very much evident in the way archives are constituted and categorized, made accessible or inaccessible. So archives are also sites of production of new meanings, not repository of documents, but active spaces where undermined narrative can be found and exposed. So I would say in just few sentences to give you a little bit of a context to what Archive is, because I'm sure that some of you are not familiar with our work. So to come back with the work, to the work with the students, I also want to start by saying that the course we are teaching is inscribed in a curriculum of visual arts, which is of course important to mention because some of the consideration and some of the things that I will be showing might not apply to other paths, but certainly they do to the art, to the visual art field and studies within the visual art field. And I mean, we can also say in a way without any risk of being wrong that Italy really requires a very heavy coordinated action of decolonization, especially in the curricula of art. So the students that we are working with are primarily interested in forming their practice as artists or curators, so not forcefully interested in publishing per se, but nevertheless we considered how to emphasize the importance of reading with suspect and thinking with authors, which will allow them to form a critical approach towards dominant narratives and identify historical bias as a basis for their practice. So even if our course is very much center on publishing, we believe that in a way using these arguments would really contribute or could contribute to helping in a way the structuring and certain systems that are very much imprinted in the way of thinking. So over the years, we became aware of the years teaching in NABA and working with students for more than a decade. We became aware of the lack of knowledge with regard of fascist regime and Italian colonialism. Some of the students actually haven't studied this part of history for maybe 3 or 4 days in their entire curriculum. So out of this realization, we try to imagine a way to keep, to create space within our course, or somehow to hijack our course on art publishing to actually try to work on the subject that will allow them inevitably to understand. And I'm sorry, bear with me, because this is really like a super simple, I mean, I know that many of you are absolutely familiar with every single point that I will touch, but it's just more to give you a little bit of an overview and really to then hear your feedback about it. So then, coming to this understanding that there was really a lack of time for the students to actually discover and study and analyze that part of history, some question also came to our mind while thinking about publishing. So how can we talk about publishing processes and editing if a critical way of thinking is not formed, or even an artistic and curatorial practice for that matter? So how can we, in a way, try to use our course for that? So how can we work within nowadays maze of medias and digital technology in a complex scenario of multiple words and temporalities without understanding our recent past and the implications? So, and more importantly, where we can create the condition to address these questions? How can we locate this conversation in a physical space and ask the students to interact with people rather than digital interfaces for a moment, also to interrupt a certain habit that became also, again, over the course of this year quite obvious. So how students are less and less reading, again, talking from the art field, reading a full book, how they are actually researching through fragments that they can obtain on their different devices that they carry with them at all time. So not undermining, of course, the importance of learning how to understand the complexities of the scenario that is irreversibly changing the way we communicate and learn. We thought about how we could create or locate this research project in a physical space where there could be human interactions that will eventually affect both parties, the students and the other side. So while preparing the outline of the course, I remembered a very beautiful conversation between Angela Davis and Toni Morrison that took place in the New York Public Library. And Angela Davis was basically starting the conversation by saying, I actually wanted to begin by talking a bit about the inaccessibility of libraries, and I'm thinking about my own childhood when I saw this incredible building in Birmingham made out of Indiana limestone. It was the Birmingham Public Library, but of course it was only for white people. The one black library that existed was run down, very few books. And I tell this story because I first entered the door of this library, the New York Public Library, in 1959, and I can remember how I felt to actually walk into a real library, because although I had used the library in Birmingham, it was very lacking of resources and broken down. So in a way, while sort of this really resonated, because of course this is a very specific located story in the United States in a very specific scenario, but somehow this idea of looking at the library became one of the possibility of sending the students down to an interface that is actually made of humans and looking at ways of categorizing and organizing the spaces. So while thinking about this conversation, the decision sort of was made to use as a ground for the project the libraries. So many of which, by the way, are undergoing processes of transformation and digitalization, and in simultaneously some becoming dead places that are not used, and other actually becoming the center of interest, also in terms of funding and other things. So in an attempt to analyze how the colonial matrix of power manifests through its institution, we decided to observe and investigate the space of the library, how this repository of knowledge are replicating those same principles that are foundational in other institutions, such as museums and archives. So the aim of the project, in some ways, is to tackle the relationship between colonialism and fascism, and challenging the processes of programmatic erasure that the students are also sort of trapped in or part of. And so very practically, how now I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of how we decided to organize the project, and then show you some of the outcome. So very practically, we asked the students to first map the libraries in Milan, really looking into the different typologies of library, because of course there are very different type of libraries, and the relationship that are formed within the libraries are also extremely different. So establish a group of libraries that we could somehow represent the different typologies, plan different field trips, first getting a knowledge with the chosen structure, and then starting conversation with the librarians and other workers within the libraries, so trying to discover what are the specificity, and of course at the end the aim of the project was also to trace what is there, what is not there, how certain knowledges are accessible or not. So then the idea was to prepare a list to interact with this with the librarians, really trying to figure out how the decision process functions, so who decides what gets ordered, who decides how things are displayed, organized, and so on and so forth, which of course we know there are a lot of rules in the question of how things are categorized and catalogized, so this is, which is not the right word, but by the way, we do. So this was a first step, a first attempt. I mean, we are now basically thinking about replicating this process every year, and also in the process, each outcome of a group that went to a specific library will be brought into the discussion, and the students from previous year will be invited to talk to the students that are actually now following a similar path. So to the research, to identify trajectories that we'll want to follow relating to what is preserved in the library, but also looking at what is visibly absent, and to imagine a form of restitution or display or program that could happen within the space that they encountered with the relationship that they formed. So the idea was to then ask the libraries to host, which in actually a few cases happened, so to host either display of material that the students brought out of the library, analyzed, and then recomposed into an assemblage that was then presented within the library. So, I mean, in a moment, I'm getting there very fast. So, but in a moment, I'll show you a few of the outcomes. That, as I said, I mean, I also some of them then decided to continue with the research and then turn these into their thesis. So there are few projects that are still open. But I just wanted to, briefly share also what we shared with the students at the very beginning, just to try to foster also different approaches, and obviously kind of giving them a motivation to go into this research. So in a way, understanding the way in which during imperialism world power relationship have been shaped, it is of imperative importance to understand the present. And Italy, even if this part of history tend to be minimized, has participated in the reconfiguration of the global order. So acquiring colonies and later becoming an imperial power have represented for the country a way to construct the Italian citizen, that is to create a cohesion in the population. However, it often happens that the extent of Italian expansion project and the study of this historical period is neglected to the benefit of historic events of greater magnitude, which I will definitely disagree with. So the project stems from the desire to counteract this trend. So present-day Italy is playing a central role in the Mediterranean crisis, and it is in this story, the other protagonists are also very much connected with Italy, especially Libya, Eritrea, as we know. So Italy can no longer ignore, and again, talking from the arts, which I repeat constantly because I know that there are actually many universities where there are incredible groups forming and researches and even practical workshops happening at all time. But unfortunately, the system of public academies and then the few private schools that are dedicated to the teaching of visual arts are actually very, very behind in the understanding of this part of our recent history and the implications in the present. So one other element that we gave, and that's really, I swear, the last point, because it was a little bit also a starting point to not to impose the students to choose a certain path, but more to create a few points of entry so that they could then very autonomously decide what they would like to address and how to address this apparatus of the library. So we kind of went back also and just underlining how the library policy, the administration of libraries, the control and promotion of public reading in some of those specific problems that can be explored under the fascist regime. So the attention that fascism dedicated to all libraries, all of them, from the governmental one, municipal one, provincial one, small school, rural libraries, was actually an extreme attention because, of course, it was obvious how the function that they had within the education and social control. So fascism, like all totalitarian regime, was aware of the importance of the book and the library as mediators. And again, I'm saying things that might be obvious, but somehow this is more of a proposition that was made to the students, so to think of the book and the library as mediators of ideology and consensus. And so they were basically sent out to look for the traces of and the lack and the voluntary erasure of a certain type of literature, and also really explore how first ended, so removed from another way of relating with contents. So I mean, I'm going to start with the group that actually worked on exactly on La Difesa della Razza. Why? Because this was discussed yesterday. So basically, within these different groups that were formed to conduct this project, one group decided to analyze the cover of La Difesa della Razza, and I'm now showing you what they decided to do, and also, maybe some of the conversation that went on, because what they proposed was to, in order to analyze the image, to remove everything else, so to really look at the images and remove all the lettering and all the other forms, so to really put the attention towards how the images were constructed and how the propaganda images were constructed. I think this one is probably one that was discussed yesterday amply, and of course it is, I think, one of the most efficient in terms of propaganda and construction of the image, but is actually, and it was also repeated a certain amount of times. So I'm just, going through these images, and then I'll, what they propose to do. This is one of the projects that was not realized, unfortunately, but basically the proposal was to have this material printed, and then for each image, there is a sort of the construction of the image and the narratives that are pushed forward and the strategies that are behind these images. So they were basically printed in the size of the cover and then displayed on a table within the library in the area of, in the reading area. So then people could really read for each cover, which was then credited in the back of these images, read the analysis coming from the students, from their own perspective, and of course through a lot of research also around how these images were constructed. So this was, for example, one of the way they sort of reacted to this invitation to go into the library, and they found in one of the library a quite the complete set of the La Difesa della Razza, so they were able to scan each cover and then to rework them, to really analyze what are the strategies behind them. And again, I know that this is a bit of a strange jump after the day that we had today, but I think that somehow these are also, I mean, for me, there are some steps that needs to be taken also in order to then bring this project and together with the students think about how there are traces of these forms of propaganda and construction of images and the use of images and how they are deployed also today.
Is there examples of magazines today that you find these images again used in, or commercials on TV where they may even structure the image exactly the same way?
This is not.
But we saw them, but I'm asking a kind of a.
It is. I mean, there has been a
question. They weren't. I saw those images yesterday, but I'm asking.
I mean, there is not a magazine that one could place next to this one.
Right.
But the strategy that started here are now replicated in advertisement. I mean, especially in advertisement, there is actually a quite traceable history of how also, you know, the bodies have been used and how, without really considering any type of criticality of using the bodies in certain ways, have been used. So
I'm talking about the picture. You're really talking about picture science, which is something I'm totally interested in right now. Because for the real estate of the image thing I'm doing next year, I mean, this would be perfect, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm asking, you know, as far as the picture science, you know.
No, I mean, it is actually the strategies that have been used recently in any type of advertisement connected to, even actually, to be honest, to bring it to Germany, in Germany is exactly the same. I mean, you have these languages deployed by the far right a little bit everywhere in the world, using different means of communications, but it is really this originating in these strategies. They are not only here, actually, they're even older, of course, than this moment. But what we are trying in a way to address with the students, how if you don't have clear this moment down, how can you actually understand all the coding that is in the things that you are experiencing today, which are not only happening on paper and with a certain distance and time for you to get to understand them, but they're actually getting at a certain speed at you. So that's a little bit where we are locating this phase. And just, sorry, because that's where I really stop, but the idea is really that this is now organically growing. So that's why I was also so happy to be able to share it with you, because the idea is that we then gonna follow, you know, a certain trajectory, possibly coming to exactly what you are asking, you know, with the next classes, also using the work of the other students. So trying to somehow re-put always in conversation the material that has been used, connected, collected over the classes. And I'm maybe not getting so much into each project, because of course, I mean, with each group, there's been a lot of discussion and negotiation. And to be honest, I was extremely, I realized how the group that we are working with are just hungry for this. You know, it's not like there is a lack of necessity, because the minute you give just the right entry point, then they just go very straight for a sort of autonomous research, and they come back with very, very pertinent findings. Sorry, I should. No, because the whole idea was also to open up, to discuss from the very start. So go.
Okay, thank you. Now, just to add to what you said a second ago about the fact that we can experience this kind of images, even though not in one only, in one single journal, but somehow
everywhere,
spread.
everywhere.
This is to me, this is particularly striking when we look at women images. I mean, the way in which nowadays in Italy the female body is conceived and designed is astonishingly alike to these. But really, I mean, like posters who that add machines to you know, like how do you say l'aspirapolveri? Hoover, or the female body is portrayed like this.
In Italy, in that journal, among other postcards, etc., for example, with the colonial enterprise in Ethiopia, I mean, the type of female body of the Ethiopian woman was completely sexualized because the counterpart of the Italian fascist woman instead, exactly. So actually soldiers and essentially young generations were encouraged to join the colonial enterprise via sex, until the issuing of the racial laws in 1938, which all in a sudden then make biracial, illegal. So it's actually quite interesting because that then we can relate to Berlusconism and the new type of sexualized femininity that the whole kind of 80s, 90s, and so on in Italy sort of encourages, which is very similar. Yeah.
I mean, this image very easily exists today. I mean, there is this AfD poster in Germany that is going on now, where you see a woman pregnant, you see only the smile, and then it's called the Neideutsche, the new Germans, and this is exactly the Salvini idea of, you know, we have to repopulate Italy with Italians. So I mean, one could even, and of course, this was actually a proposition at the beginning, also to re-interact with these images, trying to use slogans from today, but then we decided that this will be problematic because then it will bring really a non-understanding, you know, so we kind of kept separate by proximity, by showing some of the contemporary slogans together with these images. You can immediately see the proximity, but then you don't create one object that contains both. So, yeah, this was one project that really looked at especially at this journal that was really talked about yesterday, and I'm actually very sad that I wasn't here. But then there were very different approaches. I mean, in the process, I'm just going to show you this quickly. So, the different libraries, we sort of created a register with all the libraries that have been visited, and the questions that were posed to the member of the libraries, and then trying to really see what is the difference of the small neighborhood library and where are actually certain collections. Are there, you know, library where you could locate material that could help, you know, somehow criticize the situation more or be more aware of the situation or not. And this is also in the making, because the idea is really at the end to trace, you know, where is, and at this I can already say, even if they're preliminary fundings, but in a way that books like by author like Fanon, for example, are quite lacking. And it's shocking because, of course, there was the Centro di Documentazione Franz Fanon in Italy in the 60s for a very short amount of time, but then it's impressive how even something that should be anywhere available is actually not available. Then one could start going into what is not translated, and we can really go on for for many hours to talk about that. But it was quite shocking, and I have to say, some months after we started the project, I also connected with Zaya Ramadi, who is doing a similar, actually a much larger scale project in France. So she's really looking with the institute that she's working with, which is a massive institute with many researchers, into the missing literature within the library system in France, which again would be to a certain extent, should be even more surprising to find out that certain authors are not so available in every single library in France. So then of course it became for us the fact of sending the students, asking them and they kind of didn't like this idea of going into a physical space, which was of course for someone like me definitely not a digital native and definitely not, you know, researching. I mean, I started and I for myself using these places. But then they kind of appreciated the fact that they needed to do it in person because they also went through the architecture, how the architecture is structured, how the books are structured. And then these were also elements that they tried to reincorporate in their project of display. And so some actually decided to bring up some of the books that they thought were more interesting. And then from this book, some of the project came out. So this is now basically something that we are trying to render also available, not only on my hard drive.
It's been interesting to see the fact that a kind of a strong movement such as the feminist movement Non Una Di Meno, I said, on kind of communication via social media recently exactly on this issue. So I'm thinking about two cases. One has been the pink washing of Indro Montanelli's statue. The feminists threw this pink paint on the statue of this Italian journalist Montanelli, who's a bit of a kind of revered figure in Italian mainstream culture. But he became famous. He also issued this interview. He was a fascist during the war, and he had a 12-year-old child, Eritrean child, as a wife. He took her as a wife when he was in Africa as part of the fascist expedition. So they pinkwashed it, and the kind of the first reaction from the main newspapers and also various kind of social media groups was to attack them for vandalism, but it was a really strong answer by the Non Una Di Meno groups and pages, and they not only stopped those critics, but the mainstream newspaper Repubblica was forced to change the headlines, kind of, and that was really interesting because there was an effective movement on the ground. And the other example was the use of fascist propaganda poster. It's your woman, save her from rape, from the black man, basically, from the fascist times, which was reused by left-wing groups when one of the fascist groups, Casa Pound, two guys who belonged to Casa Pound were accused of raping a woman, and they used it, you know, to kind of say the Casa Pound people, they protect your women from Casa Pound. And again, the kind of Non Una Di Meno backlash against the leftist appropriation of the image was strong. So when I said there was no actual action on social media by the left, I have to take it back, because I think the kind of feminist movement has been very effective, and the interesting has been in relation to the kind of iconography of fascism, and especially the representation of colonized women. Just wanted to bring that up.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, when it comes to colonialism, I guess that the left and the right, they do have very similar problems. In Italy, I mean, certainly.
I mean, the Casa Pound as a new right movement in Italy also has this myth of Fahrenheit 451, the film, in which it's about books. No, it's a film about books, and it's crazy about how Casa Pound and other right-wing groups actually appropriate films from different points. Also, people like Pasolini, for example, they appropriate to take into their canon actually, and they say that actually these books they have to save them like the fascist books, because the left would take them out of the libraries and burn them, you know, secretly, and put in all the Frantz Fanon and so on. And actually, that's not happening, as you just say.
No, it's
just
not.
a comment.
I mean, we hope actually in some years to really have also a more complete account of different cities, not only Milan. So the idea is also to try to establish collaborations. It is not just to stay in the physical library. I mean, the idea, which is why I was also very happy to share with you, is how this could be then brought also to the discussion of that complicates everything with how to relate with the new digital technologies. And
I mean, actually, yes, and I find that quite interesting with Casa Pound in relationship also to the architecture of distribution of knowledge, because in terms of Casa Pound, I mean, this is now already 1 or 2 decades ago, that they've kind of replaced what before social houses were doing. I mean, a lot of the sort of fights that Casa Pound now brings forth were the fights that historically were actually of the socialist movement, such as the right to housing, for example, and so on. So it's a complete, you know, ideological mix where references come really from and are obviously reinterpreted and exploited within, you know, the discourse that whatever is necessary for.
I don't want to move away at all from the fascist question, just to add another layer. I just discovered a small book called Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture, which is not against at all, but it's Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today. Mm-hmm. And this author, maybe you know him, he make a study of really of the picture, of the images mm-hmm. that we see every day about the Anthropocene, the climatic change, the environmental crisis, and looking at the way in which these images show us the world, he somehow draws a history. It's an epistemological analysis on the way in which we understand the climate change, thanks to these images that idealize the world, because all these images are taken from satellites, drones, so they picture the world as a thing, something that really exists, and it's extremely, extremely interesting. And somehow on another subject, but it's the same,
absolutely,
the same path.
Yeah. I mean, there is also something to say to the way the images are neutralized by being repeated constantly, and how we are always shown the same image to an extent that image really doesn't do anything to the question that tries to be discussed. And this is a programmatic choice. It's not something that is related to the contingency of a news. This is a programmatic choice to repeat a certain image, to show it to the point that that image doesn't have the power, which is where, I mean, just to say something that I totally agree with you, that poetry is a very important point, you know, that sort of the transformative power of poetry that can escape also certain mechanism of neutralization. For me, it's also an interesting strategy to explore. I mean, with the students also, we have been trying to think about how to render some of these researches also in other forms, you know, from not only, this is like a first step of quite classical restitution in a way. So I find traces, I show the fragments, and I try to engage with the visitors of the library. But then we also thought, why don't we try to transform this into something else? So then the findings are then transformed into an artwork. Because again, the very beautiful thing about this MA is that we are working with artists and curators at the same time, which is very interesting because first of all, there are a lot of artists that are curators. We don't really particularly like the notion of curator anyways. So it is very, very, very interesting to see how they come up with very hybrid forms of expressing.
Thank you so much, and
you,
I think maybe the question of poetry just brings back, like, actually we're closing the program tomorrow at 7 p.m. at Zwecka Project Space with with a performance and theater piece by Gabriella Germandi, who's a writer and a fiction writer and a novelist. And the piece is called Queen of Pearls and Flowers. And actually what it looks into is, let's say, contemporary Italian politics through the lens of the history and the relationship between Italy and Ethiopia. Through both the issuing of the racial laws and the experience of her own family, that then goes back to a problem, again, of law and governmentality, when thousands of children that were born out of mixed marriages were suddenly legitimized by the law to be abandoned, and basically also became subjects of racism both by, let's say, Italian society, exactly. And so that's the sort of last analysis on, just to say what we've really tried to do was like trying to root the questions that Warren Neidich has been engaging with in relationship to the American context to the Italian context, because so often it feels as if coming to the Venice Biennale with all this like fantastic, international crowd tends to become a little bit of a bubble, kind of forgetting what Italy actually is, and for instance, what a right-wing, extreme right-wing mayor, for example, the city of Venice, has right now. So it was really important to sort of try to express that or engage with that. Everything has been recorded and will be on YouTube in case some of you are interested in what has happened yesterday. Thank you so much. I don't care, I live abroad. I'm kidding. Thank you so much for coming and to all of the contributors.